And Shrishtee, I can see that you are there. Let me add the spotlight. Good
Hi,
morning, good
hello.
afternoon. Yeah, how are you?
Good morning. Just woke up and right here was listening into Shannon and quite excited.
Yeah, no, it's really, I know how much work you do, particularly in rural areas. It's excellent that you could join us today. So by way of introduction, Shrishtee Bajpai is a colleague in the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, but is doing some really remarkable work with a lot of different groups in India. And I see your name in many different symposia and talks as well, Shrishtee. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. So as we discussed, if you're happy to share some updates from your part of the world, 15 or 20 minutes would be great. And then we should have time for some Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thanks. So I'll just share a presentation because just that might be easier for visualization purposes. Okay, great. So I will just take a cue of what you both were discussing at the time I joined, and Shannon was commenting about the idea that how rights of nature as a concept in the Western legal framework is alienating for a lot of communities that have had these place-based ways of relating with nature. So I want to first start with us rooting ourselves into how communities might articulate rights. And what we are seeing when we are having these discussions, at least in our part of the world, is that usually when we ask what are rights for nature, there are very different articulations. So while this one states a story of where we were asking about the rights of river Indus, and these young children who live along the river said that the river has a right to sing, to play, to flow and live. What this gives us a sense of is that yes, there are certain legal frameworks of for rivers to have rights or for other natural entities to have rights, but there's also a sense of embodiment of what a river could be and is, and those articulations are very different from the Western legal framework. And I want to also remind how many of these communities see lands or rivers or lakes as alive beings. So one of the northeastern communities, the Dimasas, looks at the forest as a land of the elder. And these sense of what is a land, what is a river, is very much part of the articulations of people when they're talking about their rights as well. Many of these territories are not just certain small sites, but actually the entire landscapes. And because these entire landscapes are sacred and they have guardian spirits everywhere, this is something that we see all over in the Trans-Himalayan landscape of India, where people connote springs, lands, and mountains being protected by guardian spirits. And we see in many resistance movements, resistance against mining, resistance against big hydropower, that there's a sense of a very different sort of a connection with the rest of nature. So while these communities are resisting against these hydropower projects, they are saying that it's not just about us being displaced, but it is also about where would those spirits in the forest go, where would those animals, birds that live in these sacred forests go. So their sense of community is much bigger than just a human community. It's also about more than humans. And in many of these resistances, it's also the articulation that, for example, the Lepcha community in Northeast India says that we're protesting against a hydropower because it's not just that the river will be dammed and it will be polluted and it will be diverted, but also because she carries our stories of origin. So the separation between the nature and who they are doesn't exist. It's also very much damning of their identities as well. And over several decades, we have seen, especially in the Indian context, many of these movements have informed various constitutional provisions, changes in the law, and that is why some of us have been involved in looking at how this movement can actually change some of the legal provisions or work with the existing progressive legal provisions in India. And some of these movements are also happening in the cities. So we usually, when imagine about rights of nature, we think in the context of, oh, it must be happening with some indigenous community or other local communities. But we see a strong movement of articulation of protection of nature in connection with who we are is also happening in urban spaces. This is from the city that I currently live in. But amidst all of that, we see what's happening to our landscapes, and continuously rivers being polluted, diverted, forest being cut down. And so we're living in this very interesting times of dilution of progressive laws and policies, especially in the Indian context. These massive ecological crises, and also in many ways resistance of all of that, and arguing of how do we change it. And a very interesting conflict going between sacred and secular. And I don't know if you can guess, looking at this picture, this is Yamuna River, one of the very sacred rivers in India. And the white foam that you see is all the pollutant that is coming from the factories in the city of Delhi. And this man immersed inside is praying to the river. So it tells us about the crisis of all of our living and existence at the moment. And I want to highlight why this is important for us to look at, especially when we're talking about rights of nature, to not detach it from the colonial legacy of the kind of frameworks that we have had of decision making, where much of the decision was looked at from the perspective that the rest of nature is a resource to be extracted. And that is the pretty much the same logic that is being adopted by the current Indian state. And this fetishness to the neoliberal growth model continues, and we cannot talk about rights of nature with that fetishness. And in the Indian context, especially, we see that there's a limit to judicial activism. It has its limit to be able to transform society. And the last one, to just briefly reflect upon, that creation of protected areas, wildlife sanctuaries is considered, or conservation, mainstream conservation, which is pretty much again the Western legal model of conservation, is considered environmentalism. And so these are the broader crises wherein we are working, and henceforth there's a need to argue for rights of nature that is radically transforming the kind of systems that we have. And we see these kinds of broader approaches across the world about in context of rights of nature, but in the Indian context, it's pretty much the judicial approach. And we have had the 4 cases, very recent one being one of the South Indian courts actually giving a judgment saying that the whole Mother Earth is a living being. What we're seeing in the Indian context is that these judgments are not percolating on the ground. Many people don't know even about these judgments. They're happening at the court level. They're not even responding to people's resistance and protection of landscapes. So they're very they're extremely interesting in a sense that they're talking about nature being alive. So in ecological jurisprudence in the Indian context, this is amazing that the courts are speaking in this language. But what is really important is that it should respond to the crisis in many ways, that it should connect to people's movement, or people at least should know about these judgments, and which is what is not happening. Also, they're not radically speaking about how do we implement this. So for us, what has been important is to break down many of these aspects. So what is a legal person, especially in the Indian context, when personhood to the natural entities is not an easy connection to be made, because many of these natural entities could be gods and goddesses. So actually reducing them to the person might not serve the purpose. And so arguing of another sort of a system to also within the legal system to recognize these connections is important. What are the rights and liabilities and role of local communities has become important for us to actually explore in this whole context. And if the violation happens, what is the violation? Again, because most of these judgments that I just mentioned earlier, where Ganga or certain lakes or glaciers were recognized as living entities, there was no speak of violation, what constitutes a violation. And so a government can build a hydropower project in the name of renewable energy, and that's not violation. But we know it has been to the reverse. For us, has also been about thinking about governance from a very first indigenous perspective, customary governance, but also governance which is looking at transboundary rivers, because we know that nature is contiguous. It doesn't follow nation state boundaries. So how do we collaborate at a regional level has become really important. It's also about looking at this very interesting stuff that is happening, especially in the Indian context, and very unique to Indian context, is this potential of misuse of sacredness and right-wing politics, where in the Ganga judgment, the court only spoke about how river Ganga is sacred to Hindus. Now we live in a multi-faith country where there are many communities living along the river, and arguing for only one community's sacredness to the river could just add to the already very, very divided right-wing politics that is going on in this country. So these are some very contextual challenges that we face in Indian context. But for us, the broader context is the one that I started with, is to question the development and growth model, to question also this centralized political governance, to also question the legal framework that Michelle, you were and Shannon were hinting at, and argue for a pluriversal legal framework that is able to incorporate customary governance systems and speak to that. And also realizing the limits of the rights framework. It is amazing movement, it can change and transform, but it's just a means towards the larger transformations that all of us are seeking to achieve. It cannot solve all transformations that we want in this world. And so for us, it has been important to argue for systemic alternatives, which includes alternatives to capitalism, state domination, racism, human-centeredness, and continued colonialism. And for us, so as you see in this framework, rights of nature is a part of a larger transformation. So when we start to speak of rights of nature, we need to speak about who governs the natural commons. We need to speak of what kind of economies do we live in. We need to speak of what kind of cultural knowledge democracy we are seeking to achieve. So it has to be about an overall transformation. It cannot be separated from, we cannot, for example, argue that rights of nature should be there and continue with an extractive economy. It doesn't go hand in hand. So we have to also speak of issues of social well-being and justice. Who are these communities who are at the forefront of the crisis? How do we change those dynamics? How they come into the decision-making spaces? And importantly, what are these rights? Are the articulations of rights themselves? So I think we have to look at this rights of nature movement from a holistic perspective, at least from the Indian context and South Asian communities context. This is very crucial for us to not speak in a silo of just this movement. And what is at the center of all of this, as you see, is the values. And we all wonder, okay, then what brings us to this room? And I think it is these values, the values that we that connects us, that brings many of these movements from across the world, that are speaking of different way of being, different worldviews together. And they're everywhere. It's for us to visibilize them, and also to decolonize ourselves of how we look at the world, and how do we imagine many of these transformations taking place. And just listing some of these values that have emerged from our processes and our discussions with people. And I think these are the values that in many parts of the world also connect us and brings us together, of how we believe that respect for all life forms is important for our living. We believe in self-reliance for basic needs. We believe in autonomy and self-determination. And so just so that we have some time for question and answers, I just want to be very brief about this, but what broadly we are trying to argue is multiple things, that how do we look in this Anthropocene world from a different sense of place and rootedness. It's also about, for us, cultivating that sense of connection, empathy, and responsibility to the natural world. How do we stand in solidarity with more than human, as well as the communities who are struggling against this rational, extractive, cognitive empire, as well as many of these realities of crisis that we are facing. And storytelling is an important form of decolonizing. We see communities have been telling these stories of resistance, stories of making, and how do we bring back those stories as a counter narrative to the dominant story that has been told to all of us. And so what is ahead in practical sense for many of us? It's awareness, campaigning, and advocacy. also potential legal and policy strategies at South Asian level. It's also working with the international laws, such as where India has been signatories and how it can be used to in contravention wherever it is to supersede the national laws. Very crucially, what you guys were mentioning earlier is to see how the traditional law and customary law speaks to the idea of rights of rivers and or rights of nature and bridging that gap. It's also working a lot with young people on rights of nature and offering courses and speaking of this element in universities through culture, religious and other modes. It's also about, I think, that we are trying in small ways, attempting here is to create these eco regions or bioregions and speaking about those aspects in movement spaces. And so networking at both regional level, South Asia level, but also at international level, and learning of legal and policy aspects across is very important. And of course, supporting local processes of protection and conservation wherever we are. And so all of that is happening through various networks. There's a Rights of River South Asia Alliance, there's alternative constituents. There's, of course, a global network of Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, but some of the transformative or systemic alternatives work is also happening through Global Tapestry of Alternatives. And so if you guys are interested, of course, look at these networks. They're doing amazing work, but also there are some others that are not mentioned here who are also equally doing some amazing work. So thank you very much. Thanks, Michelle, for inviting me. And it has been always great to be in conversation with all of you.
Thank you so much, Shrishtee. That was awesome. And your work resonates very deeply with the work that AELA is interested in. And you know that you and I have spoken about this to your bioregional network as well. So I have a couple of questions. The first actually is about the interest in shifting governance systems to eco-regions and bioregions. Can we talk a little bit about that? Then we might come back to the role of rights and how different that can be in some of your discussions with your community. So can you talk a bit about perhaps the work of the Global Tapestry for Alternatives and also the bioregional work, as I'm personally very passionate about that kind of governance, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked because I couldn't speak much about it. I think for us, it has been that, as I was saying earlier, that nature doesn't follow any nation state boundaries. And we look at how communities have conceptualized regions as well, which have been based on the understanding of a place, of a region, and its natural expression. So in many ways, how people have imagined territories is through understanding it biologically, culturally, and economically, and what makes sense also to connect at a local space. So what we are trying to highlight is that when we do the planning, when we come up with policies, they are so devoid of what landscape we are speaking to. The policies that apply to Indian plains don't apply to the Trans-Himalayan landscape because it's just a different bioregion. So how do our land policy governance responds to that? A lot of local communities have always had that sense of developing their governance system responding to the bioregion that they live in. And that has been also very spiritual in many ways. So through this work of the bioregionalism network, we are just trying to amplify what has already been there and it has already been practiced of conceptualizing it through bioregions, but also doing another sort of a work, which is much difficult in this current political or geopolitical environment that we are in South Asian context, is to say that these really random boundaries between India and Bangladesh, India and Nepal, India and Pakistan, India and China, they have come about of the colonization that has, of course, that we have gone under, but also this has there is so much conflict between our neighboring countries that we are not able to see what brings us together. And nature has always brought us together. And so when we build a dam here in India, impacting Bangladesh, it's going to result into geopolitical situations that we see today. And this whole issue of Bangladeshis coming in India, but why they're coming in India? There is a reason. We have deprived the Bangladeshi farmers of the water that should go there rightfully. And so this connection of climate refugees, this connection of ecological crisis, but also building it into the whole political scenarios, is something that we want to challenge through the aspect of bioregions. But it is so difficult to do this in a current political environment and a geopolitics. But we are trying. We are attempting at least to do it at India level, but also at South Asia level.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? What modern law or politics talks about as transboundary isn't nature's boundaries. It's the transboundariness of the political boundaries that all emerged during the colonial project and up till today. Yeah. So yeah, I look forward to roping you into some more discussions next year as we focus more on our Greenprints project. I'm trying to point to the greenprints.org.au is AELA's bioregional, or listening to the Mother Earth first, and then rethinking what our First Nations peoples have already done on localized lawmaking to care for place, to care for country. And it's a fascinating space because we're really seeing an absolute unraveling of our mindset in the colonial projects to go, well, what is Mother Earth actually telling us? And so on that point, Shrishtee, can you give us an example, because many of the folks on this audience are Australian, they're from other places too, but as people not from your place, can you give us an example of like a pre-existing and continuing relationship? You've already touched on them, seeing the rivers as the spirits, which many groups around the world do. How is that fitting into the sort of the weight on top of it of colonial law? Because it sounds as if the traditional ways of seeing the world haven't really changed. How is that manifesting, and how are you working to try to raise that up, perhaps?
Yeah. So as I was maybe hinting at earlier when I was speaking about this really very different worldviews of existence, they're not meeting enough. And in many ways, meeting, but usually used for right-wing politics. So I'll give you an example of the river Ganga itself. Ganga is considered a goddess. She is prayed and revered by almost all the communities that live along the river. And just for visualization of people who might not know this river, Ganga originates from the Himalayas, flows through the Indian plains, and then subsequently goes to Bangladesh and falls into Bay of Bengal. And it's such an important river. And we see that it is also one of the most polluted rivers in the world. And it brings us a question that the river that is so sacred, that is a goddess, why then we desecrate in every conceivable way? It is also being used as a political tool to win elections. And yet the river remains polluted. So we are seeing this kind of a conflict that we can use the sacredness of natural entities as a way for political, because it's so important for people that you can mobilize people and win elections based on talking about a river, yet the river will remain polluted, yet the river will be dammed. So I think we are in a very interesting conflict of the sacred and secular that we're living in, and these things are not speaking to each other. We know of that there was an attempt of drafting a National Ganga River Act, but it doesn't translate into what can really truly happen on the ground, because over the last 1 decade, we have seen that there are about 3,000 crores that have been spent in rejuvenation of the river. Our Prime Minister has made promises of how they need to revive the river as one of the most important promises of their election manifesto. But we don't see that. We are also building 4-way highways in the Himalayan landscape, which is damaging all these rivers that flow through the Himalayas. So we are in a very interesting, conflict of these two worldviews, and most of the laws and policies are going against protection of the natural entities. And so it's not just about how these articulations come in the legal framework. It is really about questioning, and that's why for us it has become so important to question the on-ground policy that are coming about, but also importantly focusing on the resistance movements, and highlighting those, and highlighting and standing in solidarity of many of those, because they are articulating truly what it is to protect, and what it is to stand for natural entities, what it is to speak for them. And so rights of nature movement for us really has to work with the communities and along with the communities. It cannot happen to the court of law, is what we realize, and it has to work with local communities who are at the forefront of the resistance, and how those articulations then inform the legal systems rather than the other way around. So this is a real struggle for us, because the opposite is already visible, that even the most progressive laws and policies could be used for all the ulterior motives, but the protection of nature.
No, and it's very important to the Australian and other colonial contexts as well, because obviously when you look at the Aboriginal map of Australia, there was a beautiful patchwork quilt of bioregional governance. And I often think of the colonial laws kind of pouring concrete across them. And ever since that time, people have been trying to chip it away and come back to those local place-based laws. So it's really important for groups like AELA to connect with groups like yours and to see and be inspired by the work. Because I guess the challenge for all of us is, how do we articulate what is effectively the need for biocultural futures? You know, we can no longer rely on the universalism of Western law saying, thou shalt have a law here, exactly as you say. It doesn't speak to what's really here. And when we have conversations with our Aboriginal friends in Australia, you know, they say we had rainforest laws for rainforest people, desert laws for desert people. And what does that mean? Well, it means you're in relationship with water in one way in one place. You might not have any, and you might be in relationship with too much water in another place and have to live and work around that. So I find this a really important area, and I hope that all of us around the world can continue to grow what future law looks like based on ancient law. I think, to me, if rights of nature is a spearhead concept to open up those conversations, then we're definitely on the right track. As you might agree, for many cultures, purely a rights-based approach won't be enough, because that culture doesn't speak or think that way, but it might be a helpful way forward. So that's excellent. What else is on the horizon for your groups over the coming 12 months, Shrishtee, that we should be aware of? I encourage everyone to give advertisements for events, books, projects, anything that we can learn more about or support for you.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So for us in Horizon is to just deepen this work that you mentioned exactly, of bringing the articulation of peoples and communities, and actually working with them, people who have been in resistance or not, but actually have these strong articulations, and how do we bridge that gap of the law and articulations over the next 12 months. These are some projects that we are into, but also working with the universities and colleges on rights of nature as a course and curriculum, and international networking as well. So yeah, these three are at the moment what we are focusing on a lot with young people, because that's what it's really going to help in changing and bringing these transformations.
Yes, and I don't think you were on when Natty Green was talking about the changes in Ecuador over time, but I did ask her that question about, you know, a young person today and their notions of rights of nature and how it's in the law. How is that different from the early days of when those laws were introduced? And I don't just mean the law, we were talking about culture. And that's what she said. She said young people in Ecuador who are particularly looking at these environmental issues or laws are not asking, should we have rights of nature? They're saying, how do we implement it? How do we do this for real? And you know, some of us looking from afar are thinking, wow, seeing that kind of transformation in a country, in a culture, in a legal system, it's not there yet, but it's a very encouraging way to look at how things can change. So
yes.
Well, look, if we're going to operate completely on time, now's my time to say a huge thank you to you, Shrishtee. I've been watching questions and comments throughout your discussion. There's actually a lot of thank yous, both in the public chat, and sometimes they accidentally send them just to me. So people are saying, thank you, Shrishtee, for the enlightenment to be set for the action for nature preservation in the future. Some lovely comments there. So look, I'll say thank you, Shrishtee. We're going to invite Subin to speak about his work in the legal side, particularly of laws and stuff in India. I hope you can stay on for that. But if you can't, thank you for your time today. And I do look forward to having further very rich conversations about this biocultural future that I think we're all trying to weave. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Michelle. And I look forward to listening to Subin. So I will be here